Hey guys, tonight we're trading Roman sandals for bicycle wheels and swapping conquest for something even more audacious. The Wright brothers' utterly delusional plan to make humans fly. The two mechanics from Ohio who looked at birds and thought, you know what, we can probably do that better. They gave us aviation, aerial warfare, and the subtle art of defying gravity while trying not to die. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching me dissect history's most spectacular acts of engineering hubris. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and whether you've ever attempted anything half as crazy as strapping yourself to a homemade flying machine. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab some coffee, because this is a long one, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you think you could have invented the airplane? Adorable. Truly, like a pigeon trying to understand aerodynamics. Before you could even dream of soaring through the clouds like some majestic mechanical bird, you had to survive being raised by a bishop who collected broken toys and a mother who thought fixing clocks was a reasonable hobby for children. Welcome to the Wright household, where disappointment came standard and aviation dreams were considered only slightly less practical than alchemy. Meet Wilbur and Orville Wright, two brothers who looked at the sky and thought, you know what's missing up there? Us, probably dying. Wilbur, the older brother, possessed the kind of intense stare that could make a grown man confess to crimes he didn't commit. Orville, younger by 4 years, had the appearance of someone perpetually surprised by his own existence. Together, they formed the kind of partnership that makes you wonder if genius is just stubbornness with better marketing. Their father, Milton Wright, was a bishop in the Church of the United Brethren in Christ, which sounds impressive until you realize it mostly involved traveling around Ohio arguing with other bishops about things that mattered to precisely no one except other bishops. Their mother, Susan, was the daughter of a carriage maker, which meant she understood mechanical things, a trait she would pass down to her sons along with an alarming tendency to tinker with objects until they either worked perfectly or exploded spectacularly. The Wright family lived in Dayton, Ohio, a city whose primary claim to fame was being the kind of place where ambitious young men dreamed of leaving. It was flat, practical, and sufficiently boring that two brothers could spend their entire childhood building mechanical contraptions without anyone finding this behavior particularly noteworthy. In Dayton, eccentricity was just another word for winter hobby. Wilbur and Orville didn't attend college, which their father viewed as either a tragic waste of potential or a sensible avoidance of debt, depending on his mood. Instead, they opened a bicycle shop, because apparently, mastering two-wheeled ground transportation was the obvious stepping stone to conquering three-dimensional flight. The logic was sound. Bicycles required balance, precision engineering, and the ability to crash gracefully. All essential skills for aspiring aviators. Their bicycle business, the Wright Cycle Company, specialized in repairs, sales, and the kind of mechanical modifications that made customers either very happy or very dead. The brothers approached bicycle mechanics with the same methodical precision they would later apply to aircraft design. Every bolt was considered, every gear ratio calculated, every potential failure mode thoroughly analyzed. They weren't just fixing bicycles, they were conducting graduate-level courses in applied physics, using 10 speeds as their laboratory equipment. But bicycles, however profitable, could only hold their attention for so long. The brothers had bigger ambitions, literally. They wanted to fly, and not in the metaphorical sense that motivational speakers drone on about. They wanted to build a machine that would carry human beings through the air, defying gravity through pure engineering brilliance and what can only be described as weaponized optimism. This was 1899, remember, when the idea of human flight was considered only slightly more plausible than time travel. Most people who claimed they could fly were either charlatans, lunatics, or about to become corpses. The few serious experimenters in the field had a disturbing tendency to become one with the landscape at terminal velocity. Flying was dangerous, expensive, and completely impractical. Naturally, the Wright brothers were fascinated. Their interest in flight began, as most great obsessions do, with a toy. In 1878, when Wilbur was 11 and Orville was 7, their father brought home a small helicopter-like contraption designed by Alphonse Pied-Nord, a French aeronautical pioneer who had the courtesy to die young before seeing his ideas bastardized by amateurs. The toy was powered by a rubber band and could fly for a few seconds before crashing into furniture, pets, or the faces of startled relatives. Most children would have played with the toy until it broke, then forgotten about it. The Wright brothers, however, possessed the kind of obsessive personalities that would later make them either famous inventors or committed patients in a very nice asylum. They didn't just play with the helicopter, they studied it, rebuilt it, modified it, and then built larger versions using materials pilfered from around the house. Their mother's sewing supplies suffered considerably during this period. For the next 20 years, flight remained a background fascination while they focused on more practical pursuits like not starving. But in 1896, the aviation bug bit them again, and this time it bit hard. The trigger was the death of Otto Lilienthal, a German aviation pioneer who had been making controlled glides from artificial hills, until one day he wasn't. Lilienthal had made over 2,000 glider flights before his final, less successful attempt at human aviation. His death made headlines worldwide, not because people cared about aviation, but because watching someone attempt to fly and fail was considered quality entertainment. Most rational people would have read about Lilienthal's death and thought, well, that settles that. Flying is clearly impossible and fatal. The Wright brothers read about it and thought, interesting. I wonder what he did wrong. This was their first clue that they might not be entirely rational. They began consuming every piece of aviation literature they could find, which wasn't much. The field of aeronautics in 1899 consisted mainly of wild theories, spectacular failures, and the occasional charlatan claiming to have solved the problem of flight using methods that violated several laws of physics simultaneously. The brothers read everything scientific papers, magazine articles, patent applications, and the occasional fever dream masquerading as engineering documentation. What they discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it was clear that no one had actually solved the problem of powered human flight. Terrifying because it was also clear that everyone who had tried had either died, gone insane, or lost enough money to feed a small village for several years. The field was wide open, waiting for someone with enough intelligence to solve the technical problems and enough stupidity to actually attempt it. The Wright brothers possessed both qualities in abundance. Their first step was to write to the Smithsonian Institution, requesting information about flight research. This was like asking the Library of Congress for their best books on unicorn husbandry, but the Smithsonian, to their credit, took the request seriously. They sent a packet of materials including articles by Octave Chanute, a civil engineer who had become the unofficial clearinghouse for American aviation research, mostly by collecting detailed accounts of everyone's failures. Chanute had compiled what amounted to a comprehensive guide to not flying, documenting every failed attempt at human aviation with the thoroughness of a coroner and the enthusiasm of someone who clearly didn't intend to try any of this himself. His work was invaluable, not because it showed how to fly, but because it showed roughly 200 ways not to fly. The Wright brothers studied these failures like medical students examining cadavers, learning from each crash, each miscalculation, each moment when physics had rudely interrupted someone's aviation dreams. They also corresponded with Chanute directly, beginning a relationship that would prove crucial to their eventual success. Chanute was something of a mentor figure, offering advice, encouragement, and the occasional reality check when their enthusiasm threatened to override their judgment. He also served as an informal network hub, connecting various aviation experimenters across the country. It was like Facebook for people with a death wish and mechanical aptitude. Through Chanute, they learned about the work of other aviation pioneers, Samuel Langley, who had been funded by the War Department to develop a flying machine, and had so far succeeded only in proving that government funding could not, in fact, overcome the laws of physics. Hiram Maxim, the inventor of the machine gun, who had built a massive flying contraption that had briefly achieved flight before destroying itself and nearly killing its creator. and various other experimenters who had contributed to the field primarily by serving as cautionary examples. The more the Wright brothers learned, the more convinced they became that the problem of flight was not insurmountable, merely misunderstood. Most experimenters had focused on building powerful engines, assuming that sufficient thrust could overcome any aerodynamic shortcomings. This was like trying to solve the problem of mountain climbing by building bigger boots. The Wright brothers suspected that power was not the primary issue, control was. This insight would prove to be their crucial advantage, but first, they needed to understand the fundamentals of aerodynamics, which in 1899 were about as well established as the fundamentals of dragon psychology. The existing literature contained contradictory information, questionable mathematics, and the occasional diagram that appeared to have been drawn by someone having a seizure. The brothers decided to start from first principles, which meant conducting their own experiments. They built a small wind tunnel in their bicycle shop, a device that was essentially a wooden box with a fan at one end and a series of instruments for measuring lift and drag. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was accurate, and more importantly, it was theirs. They could test airfoil shapes, measure lift coefficients, and gather data without relying on the questionable findings of other researchers. Their wind tunnel experiments were conducted with the same methodical precision they brought to everything else. They tested over 200 different airfoil designs, carefully recording the performance of each one. The data they collected would form the foundation of their eventual success, but at the time, it simply felt like an enormous amount of tedious work that occasionally produced interesting numbers. While they were gathering data, they were also wrestling with the larger questions of aircraft design. An airplane, they realized, needed to solve three fundamental problems: lift, to overcome gravity; propulsion, to overcome drag; and most importantly, control, to prevent the entire enterprise from ending in a crater-shaped monument to human hubris. Lift seemed manageable. Their wind tunnel experiments had shown that properly shaped wings could generate sufficient lift to carry a human being, provided the wings were large enough and the human being was small enough. Propulsion was also solvable. Engines were getting lighter and more powerful every year, but control remained a mystery. The problem was that an airplane, unlike a bicycle or a horse or any other vehicle humans had previously operated, existed in three dimensions. It could pitch up or down, roll left or right, and yaw around its vertical axis. Controlling an airplane was like trying to balance a pencil on your finger while riding a unicycle during an earthquake. In the dark, most aviation pioneers had approached the control problem by trying to build inherently stable aircraft, machines that would fly straight and level without constant pilot input. This seemed logical, but the Wright brothers suspected it was fundamentally wrong. Inherent stability, they reasoned, was incompatible with maneuverability. A truly stable aircraft would be impossible to turn, climb, or descend. What they needed was an inherently unstable aircraft that could be controlled by a skilled pilot. This insight came to them while watching birds, specifically buzzards soaring over the hills around Dayton. Birds, they noticed, didn't fly by maintaining perfect stability. They constantly adjusted their wings, their tails, their entire bodies, making hundreds of tiny corrections every second. They flew by controlling instability, not by avoiding it. The Wright brothers decided to apply this principle to their aircraft design. Instead of building a stable flying machine, they would build a controllable one. This required developing a system that would allow the pilot to adjust the aircraft's attitude in all three axes: pitch, roll, and yaw. They would need elevators for pitch control, a rudder for yaw control, and some method of roll control that didn't exist on any previous aircraft. Their solution to the roll control problem was characteristically elegant and completely unprecedented. They would warp the wings, twisting them to create different amounts of lift on the left and right sides of the aircraft. This wing warping system was inspired by their observation of birds, but it was pure Wright brothers engineering, simple, effective, and completely unintuitive to anyone who hadn't spent years thinking about three-dimensional control problems. But before they could build a powered airplane, they needed to master the art of unpowered flight. Gliders were safer, cheaper, and less likely to explode spectacularly, though they offered their own unique opportunities for catastrophic failure. The brothers decided to build a series of gliders, each one incorporating lessons learned from its predecessor's inevitable crash. Their first challenge was finding a suitable location for glider experiments. Dayton was many things, but windy wasn't one of them. They needed a place with consistent winds, soft landing areas, and a notable absence of curious spectators who might interfere with their research by attempting to rescue them from their experiments. They wrote to the Weather Bureau, requesting information about wind conditions across the United States. The Weather Bureau, apparently accustomed to unusual requests, provided detailed wind data for various locations. After studying the information, the Wright brothers selected Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, a remote village on the Outer Banks that offered steady winds, soft sand dunes, and the kind of isolation that allowed a person to crash repeatedly without attracting unwanted attention. Kitty Hawk in 1900 was the kind of place that made Dayton look like a bustling metropolis. The population consisted mainly of fishermen, lighthouse keepers, and people who had gotten lost trying to go somewhere else. There were no hotels, no restaurants, and no medical facilities, which meant that any aviation experiments would need to be conducted with a healthy respect for personal safety, or at least a detailed will and testament. Wilbur arrived in Kitty Hawk in September 1900, carrying with him the components of their first glider and enough supplies to survive what he expected to be several weeks of controlled crashes. He had written ahead to the local postmaster, William Tate, explaining that he was conducting flying experiments and requesting information about accommodations. Tate had responded enthusiastically, apparently viewing the arrival of an aviation experimenter as the most exciting thing to happen in Kitty Hawk since the last shipwreck. The local residents of Kitty Hawk watched Wilbur's preparations with the polite interest of people who had seen plenty of strange behavior, but never anything quite like this. Men had come to their shores before seeking fish, fortune, or refuge from their past, but never before had anyone arrived seeking to defy gravity. They were curious but cautious, the kind of wariness that comes from living in a place where the weather can kill you and the isolation means that help is always several days away. Wilbur set up camp on the beach, living in a tent that provided about as much protection from the elements as a strongly worded letter to Mother Nature. He spent his days assembling the glider, and his evenings writing detailed letters to Orville, describing the wind conditions, the terrain, and his growing appreciation for the luxuries of indoor plumbing. The first Wright glider was a biplane with a wingspan of 17 feet and a weight of about 50 pounds. It incorporated their wing warping system and a forward elevator for pitch control, but no rudder. The pilot was intended to lie prone on the lower wing, operating the controls with his hands and feet while trying not to think too hard about what would happen if something went wrong. Their first flights were disappointing in the way that all first attempts at previously impossible things tend to be. The glider generated less lift than their calculations had predicted, required stronger winds than were available, and demonstrated a disturbing tendency to pitch nose down at the most inconvenient moments. Wilbur managed a few short hops, but nothing that could reasonably be called flight. Orville joined his brother in October, bringing with him additional supplies and the kind of moral support that only comes from having someone to share your misery. Together, they conducted more systematic tests, flying the glider as a kite to measure its performance and making incremental adjustments to improve its behavior. Their experiments attracted the attention of the local residents, who watched from a respectful distance as the two brothers from Ohio repeatedly launched themselves off sand dunes in a contraption that looked like it had been designed by someone with only a theoretical understanding of birds. The locals were polite but skeptical, the kind of skepticism that comes from a lifetime of watching the ocean destroy things that seemed much more substantial than a kite with delusions of grandeur. By the end of their first season at Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers had made significant progress in understanding the challenges of glider flight, but they were far from achieving their goal of controlled, sustained flight. Their glider had flown, technically, but only in the sense that it had briefly delayed its inevitable collision with the ground. They packed up their equipment and returned to Dayton, carrying with them valuable data and a new appreciation for the complexity of their chosen obsession. Back in Ohio, they spent the winter analyzing their results and designing their second glider. The primary lesson from their first season was that their theoretical knowledge of aerodynamics was incomplete, possibly wrong, and definitely insufficient for building a successful flying machine. They needed better data, more accurate calculations, and a glider that would actually glide rather than merely falling with style. Their second glider, built in 1901, was larger and more sophisticated than its predecessor. It had a wingspan of 22 feet, incorporated improvements to the wing warping system, and featured a more robust control system. They were confident that it would perform better than their first attempt, which, given their first attempt's performance, was not setting the bar particularly high. They returned to Kitty Hawk in July 1901, again setting up camp on the beach and again attracting the polite attention of the local residents. Their second season of experiments was more systematic than their first, with carefully planned test flights and detailed data collection. They were approaching their aviation research with the methodical precision of scientists, which would have been more reassuring if science had any established principles for human flight. The second glider performed better than the first, but it still fell short of their expectations. It generated more lift and was easier to control, but it also demonstrated some alarming tendencies, including a habit of suddenly diving toward the ground for no apparent reason. The brothers made numerous modifications throughout their stay, adjusting the wing camber, relocating the center of pressure, and generally trying to convince their glider to behave more like a bird and less like a poorly designed projectile. Despite the challenges, they made genuine progress during their second season. They achieved glides of several hundred feet, learned to control their aircraft in all 3 dimensions, and gained valuable experience in the art of crashing gracefully. More importantly, they identified the specific problems that were limiting their performance and began developing solutions. The most significant problem was that the existing aerodynamic data was wrong. The lift and drag coefficients published in the aviation literature bore little resemblance to the actual performance of their wings. This meant that all of their careful calculations were based on flawed assumptions, which explained why their gliders consistently underperformed their theoretical predictions. They returned to Dayton in August 1901, frustrated but not defeated. They had made progress, but not as much as they had hoped. The problem of flight was proving more difficult than they had anticipated, which was saying something, since they had anticipated it would be extremely difficult. They needed better data, and the only way to get it was to collect it themselves. This led to the construction of their Wen Tunnel, a project that consumed much of the winter of 1901-1902. Their Wen Tunnel was not particularly sophisticated by modern standards, but it was a significant advance over the existing methods of aerodynamic research, which consisted mainly of building full-scale aircraft and seeing what happened when you jumped off things with them. The wind tunnel allowed them to test airfoil shapes systematically, measuring lift and drag under controlled conditions. They tested over 200 different wing configurations, gradually building a database of accurate aerodynamic information. This work was tedious, time-consuming, and absolutely crucial to their eventual success. It was also conducted in complete secrecy. They didn't want their competitors to benefit from their research, assuming they had any competitors who weren't already dead or bankrupt. Their Wen Tunnel data revealed that the best existing aerodynamic theory was not just wrong, but spectacularly wrong. The Smeaton coefficient, a fundamental constant used in lift calculations, was off by nearly 60%. This explained why virtually every aviation experimenter had built aircraft that failed to perform as predicted. They had all been using the same flawed data, which meant they were all making the same fundamental mistakes. Armed with accurate aerodynamic data, the Wright brothers designed their third glider during the spring of 1902. This aircraft incorporated everything they had learned from their previous experiments and their wind tunnel research. It was larger than its predecessors, with a wingspan of 32 feet, and featured a more sophisticated control system that included a movable rudder linked to the wing warping controls. They arrived at Kitty Hawk in August 1902, bringing with them their new glider and a confidence born of hard-won knowledge. Their third season of experiments would prove to be the breakthrough they had been seeking. The 1902 glider flew beautifully, achieving glides of over 600 feet and demonstrating precise control in all three dimensions. They had solved the fundamental problems of unpowered flight. But they weren't satisfied with gliding. Their ultimate goal was powered flight, which meant adding an engine and propeller to their successful glider design. This presented new challenges. The engine had to be light enough not to destroy the aircraft's performance, but powerful enough to overcome the additional drag of propeller-driven flight. The propeller had to be efficient enough to convert engine power into useful thrust, while operating in the complex airflow behind the aircraft's wings. They spent the winter of 1902-1903 designing their first powered aircraft. The engine was their biggest challenge. Existing automobile engines were too heavy, and aviation engines didn't exist yet because aviation didn't exist yet. They enlisted the help of Charlie Taylor, a machinist who worked in their bicycle shop, to build a custom engine that would meet their specifications. Taylor's engine was a masterpiece of practical engineering. It weighed only 180 pounds but produced 12 horsepower, giving it a power-to-weight ratio that was better than any existing engine. It was simple, reliable, and specifically designed for the demands of aircraft use. Taylor built it in 6 weeks using basic machine tools and the kind of mechanical intuition that comes from a lifetime of making things work. The propeller design was equally challenging. There was no existing theory of propeller design, because there had never been a need for one. The Wright brothers approached the problem by treating the propeller as a rotating wing, applying their hard-won understanding of aerodynamics to the design of an efficient thrust-generating device. They calculated the optimal blade angle, chord length, and rotational speed, then built wooden propellers that incorporated their theoretical insights. Their powered aircraft, which they called the Wright Flyer, was completed in the fall of 1903. It was a biplane with a wingspan of 40 feet, powered by Taylor's engine, driving 2 pusher propellers through a chain drive system borrowed from bicycle technology. The pilot lay prone on the lower wing, operating the controls with his hips and hands while the engine roared behind him. They shipped the Flyer to Kitty Hawk in September 1903, but mechanical problems and bad weather delayed their first powered flight attempts until December. The local residents watched their preparations with the same polite interest they had shown during previous seasons. But there was a new sense of anticipation. Word had spread that the Wright brothers were attempting something unprecedented, and their gliding successes had demonstrated that they were serious experimenters rather than merely deluded enthusiasts. December in Kitty Hawk was cold, windy, and generally unpleasant, but the Wright brothers pressed ahead with their preparations. They had been working toward this moment for 4 years, and they were not about to be deterred by uncomfortable weather. They tested their engine, checked their propellers, and waited for conditions suitable for their first powered flight attempt. On December 14, 1903, they were ready. They had invited several witnesses, including members of the local life-saving station and a few curious residents of Kitty Hawk. The witnesses were there partly to document what they expected to be either a historic achievement or a spectacular failure, but mostly because watching someone attempt to fly was still considered quality entertainment, regardless of the outcome. Wilbur won the coin toss for the honor of making the first flight attempt. The Flyer was positioned on a launching rail that the brothers had constructed on the side of a sand dune. The engine was started, the propellers began turning, and Wilbur climbed aboard his flying machine, probably wondering if he had remembered to update his will. The first attempt was not successful. The Flyer lifted off the launching rail, but immediately pitched up too steeply, stalled, and crashed into the sand after flying for only about 3 seconds. The crash caused minor damage to the aircraft and major damage to Wilbur's dignity, but no serious injuries. The witnesses watched respectfully as the Wright brothers examined the wreckage and began making repairs. 2 days later, on December 17, 1903, they were ready to try again. This time it was Orville's turn to pilot the machine. The weather was cold and windy, with gusts up to 27 miles per hour, but the brothers decided to proceed. They had been waiting for this moment too long to be discouraged by less than perfect conditions. The Flyer was again positioned on its launching rail. The engine was started, and Orville took his position on the aircraft. Wilbur ran alongside the machine as it accelerated down the rail, steadying the wing tip until the aircraft lifted off. At 10:35 a.m. on December 17, 1903, the Wright Flyer achieved the first powered, controlled, sustained flight in human history. The flight lasted 12 seconds and covered 120 feet. By modern standards, it was not particularly impressive. A person could run farther in the same amount of time. But it was flight, genuine flight, the kind that had been the exclusive domain of birds and angels since the beginning of time. For 12 seconds, a human being had travelled through the air under his own power, controlled the direction of his movement, and landed safely. The Wright brothers made 3 more flights that day, with each flight longer than the previous one. The fourth and final flight lasted 59 seconds and covered 852 feet. Between flights, they discussed their performance, made minor adjustments to their aircraft, and probably tried not to think too hard about the fact that they were routinely doing something that had been considered impossible since the dawn of civilization. The witnesses to their flights were impressed, but not overwhelmed. They had seen the Wright brothers' gliding experiments in previous years and had gradually become accustomed to the idea that human flight might actually be possible. The powered flights were clearly a significant achievement, but they were also a logical progression from the brothers' earlier work. The witnesses signed a statement documenting what they had seen, then went about their daily business, as if they hadn't just witnessed one of the most significant moments in human history. The Wright brothers packed up their aircraft and returned to Dayton, carrying with them the satisfaction of having achieved their goal and the knowledge that they had fundamentally changed the world. They had solved the problem of human flight through patient research, systematic experimentation, and the kind of stubborn persistence that their neighbours had always found mildly alarming. But their achievement was just the beginning. They had proven that powered flight was possible, but their aircraft was still a fragile, barely controllable contraption that required ideal conditions and considerable skill to operate. They needed to improve its performance, increase its reliability, and demonstrate its practical value to a world that was still skeptical about the whole idea of human flight. The immediate reaction to their achievement was surprisingly muted. A few newspapers reported their flights, but the stories were generally buried on inside pages and treated as curiosities rather than world-changing events. Most people simply didn't believe that 2 bicycle mechanics from Ohio had succeeded where brilliant scientists and well-funded inventors had failed. The idea was too remarkable to be credible. This skepticism worked to the Wright brothers' advantage. While the world ignored their achievement, they continued to improve their aircraft in relative privacy. They built new versions of their flyer, each one more capable than its predecessor. They learned to fly for longer periods, to turn and maneuver with confidence, and to take off and land under a variety of conditions. Their flying field was a cow pasture outside Dayton called Huffman Prairie, which they leased from a local farmer who was probably amused by the idea of grown men playing with flying machines in his field. The pasture was far from ideal for aviation experiments. It was small, surrounded by trees, and frequented by livestock that showed no respect for the historic nature of the activities taking place above their heads. But it was private and convenient, and it allowed the Wright brothers to conduct their research without attracting unwanted attention. They spent 1904 and 1905 gradually extending their flying capabilities. Their flights grew longer and more confident as they gained experience with their aircraft and learned to handle the challenges of powered flight. By the end of 1905, they were making flights of over 30 minutes duration, covering distances of more than 20 miles. They had progressed from barely controlled hops to genuine aerial transportation. But even as their capabilities improved, public awareness of their achievements remained limited. The Wright brothers were secretive about their work, partly to protect their competitive advantage, and partly because they had learned that premature publicity could interfere with serious research. They continued to fly in relative obscurity, while the world gradually awakened to the reality of human flight. The breakthrough in public recognition came in 1908, when the Wright brothers finally decided to demonstrate their aircraft publicly. Wilbur travelled to Europe, where he conducted flying demonstrations that astonished crowds and convinced skeptics that human flight was not only possible but practical. Meanwhile, Orville conducted similar demonstrations in the United States, proving that their achievements were not flukes but the result of genuine mastery of aerial technology. These public demonstrations changed everything. The Wright brothers went from unknown experimenters to international celebrities virtually overnight. Their flying exhibitions drew enormous crowds and generated massive press coverage. The age of aviation had officially begun, and the Wright brothers were recognized as its pioneers. But success brought new challenges. Other inventors and entrepreneurs rushed to enter the aviation field, some developing original designs and others simply copying Wright technology. Patent disputes became common as the rapidly expanding aviation industry sorted out questions of intellectual property and commercial rights. The Wright brothers found themselves spending as much time in courtrooms as in cockpits, defending their innovations against competitors who had arrived late to the party but were determined to claim their share of the profits. The legal battles were frustrating but ultimately successful. The Wright brothers' patents were upheld, and their position as the inventors of the airplane was legally established. But the patent fights also consumed time and energy that might have been better spent on continued innovation. While they were arguing with lawyers, other inventors were pushing the boundaries of aviation technology, developing faster, more reliable, and more capable aircraft. This is not to diminish their achievement. The Wright brothers had solved the fundamental problems of human flight, and their success made all subsequent aviation development possible. They had demonstrated that careful research, systematic experimentation, and persistent effort could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Their work provided the foundation for an entire industry that would transform transportation, commerce, and warfare. Their approach to the problem of flight was characteristically methodical and scientific. They didn't rely on intuition or luck. They gathered data, tested theories, and built upon their failures. They treated each crash as a learning opportunity rather than a defeat, and they never let temporary setbacks discourage them from pursuing their ultimate goal. This scientific approach was perhaps their greatest contribution to aviation. More important even than their specific technical innovations, the Wright brothers also demonstrated the value of collaboration. While Wilbur was generally recognized as the leader of their partnership, both brothers contributed essential skills and insights to their success. Wilbur was the theorist and the public face of their operation, while Orville was the hands-on engineer who translated their ideas into working hardware. Neither brother could have succeeded alone. Their complementary skills and shared obsession were essential to their achievement. Their success also highlighted the importance of choosing the right problem to solve. While other aviation pioneers focused on building powerful engines or stable aircraft, the Wright brothers recognized that control was the key challenge. Their decision to build an inherently unstable but controllable aircraft was counterintuitive but ultimately correct. It allowed them to develop genuine flying skills while their competitors were still trying to build aircraft that would fly themselves. The location of their experiments was also crucial to their success. Kitty Hawk provided the consistent winds and soft landing areas they needed for safe glider experiments. But more importantly, it provided isolation from the distractions and skepticism they would have encountered closer to home. In Kitty Hawk, they could focus entirely on their research without worrying about public opinion or commercial pressures. Their background in bicycle mechanics proved to be ideal preparation for aviation work. Bicycles required the same attention to weight, strength, and precision that would be essential in aircraft design. The Wright brothers understood materials, mechanical systems, and the importance of getting every detail right. They also understood the business side of manufacturing, which would prove valuable when they began producing aircraft commercially. But perhaps most importantly, the Wright brothers possessed the kind of personality that made sustained, difficult research possible. They were patient enough to conduct hundreds of wind tunnel tests, persistent enough to return to Kitty Hawk year after year despite repeated disappointments, and confident enough to continue working when virtually everyone else thought they were wasting their time. They had the intellectual curiosity to question established wisdom and the engineering skills to develop better solutions. Their achievement was not a sudden breakthrough, but the result of years of methodical work. They built upon the research of their predecessors, learned from their own failures, and gradually developed the knowledge and skills necessary for success. Their first flight was the culmination of a long process of discovery, not a moment of inspiration or luck. The Wright brothers changed the world, but they changed it quietly, methodically, and with a minimum of drama. They were not the kind of inventors who worked in brilliant flashes of insight. They were the kind who solved problems through careful analysis and patient experimentation. Their approach was less romantic than the popular image of invention, but it was ultimately more effective. Their success also demonstrated that technical achievement and commercial success do not always go hand in hand. The Wright brothers were undoubtedly the pioneers of human flight, but they did not dominate the aviation industry they had created. Other manufacturers, often using Wright technology but offering better marketing or more convenient locations, captured much of the early aviation market. The Wright brothers were better inventors than they were businessmen, a common situation among technical pioneers. This pattern would repeat throughout the history of aviation. The companies that achieved the greatest commercial success were often not the ones that made the most significant technical contributions. Innovation and commercialization required different skills, and few individuals or companies excelled at both. The Wright brothers were innovators first and entrepreneurs second, which served them well in solving the problem of flight, but less well in profiting from their solution. Despite their commercial challenges, the Wright brothers' place in history was secure. They had achieved something that had been considered impossible for thousands of years, and they had done it through intelligence, persistence, and methodical research. Their success opened the door to the aviation age and made possible all the subsequent developments in air transportation, military aviation, and space exploration. Their story is also a reminder that revolutionary achievements often come from unexpected sources. The Wright brothers were not university professors or well-funded researchers. They were bicycle mechanics from Ohio who happened to be fascinated by the problem of flight. They succeeded where others failed not because they had better resources or more education, but because they approached the problem more systematically and were willing to put in the years of work necessary to solve it. The brothers' relationship with each other was also crucial to their success. They worked together seamlessly, sharing ideas, dividing responsibilities, and supporting each other through the inevitable frustrations of experimental work. Neither brother received individual credit for their achievement. They were always referred to as the Wright brothers, emphasizing their collaborative approach. This partnership was one of their greatest strengths, providing them with both the technical breadth and the emotional support necessary for their long journey to success. Their legacy extends far beyond their specific technical achievements. The Wright brothers established the model for systematic experimental research that would be followed by countless other inventors and engineers. They showed that complex technical problems could be solved through careful analysis, methodical testing, and persistence in the face of repeated failures. Their approach became the standard method for tackling difficult engineering challenges. The years following their first flight were a curious mixture of vindication and frustration. The world that had ignored them for years suddenly couldn't get enough of the Wright brothers. Every newspaper wanted interviews, every magazine wanted articles, and every entrepreneur wanted to license their patents or steal their designs. Fame, it turned out, was almost as complicated as flight, and considerably more annoying. Wilbur and Orville found themselves thrust into a spotlight they had never sought. They were invited to prestigious events, offered lucrative contracts, and treated as celebrities by people who couldn't tell a wing warp from a weather vane, but were absolutely certain that aviation was the future of everything. The brothers, who had spent years working in comfortable anonymity, suddenly found privacy as elusive as their early attempts at sustained flight. The business side of aviation proved to be every bit as challenging as the technical side, but far less rewarding. While designing and building aircraft required skills the Wright brothers possessed in abundance, Marketing their invention required talents they had never needed to develop. They were engineers, not salesmen, and they approached business negotiations with the same methodical precision they had applied to aerodynamics, which is to say they were thorough, accurate, and completely unprepared for the creative dishonesty that characterized early aviation commerce. Their first major business challenge came from an unexpected source: the United States government. The same War Department that had funded Samuel Langley's spectacular failures was suddenly very interested in acquiring Wright aircraft for military use. This should have been good news, but government contracting in 1908 involved the kind of bureaucratic complexity that made three-dimensional flight control seem straightforward by comparison. The government wanted demonstrations, specifications, performance guarantees, and competitive bidding processes. They wanted the Wright brothers to prove their aircraft could meet military requirements while simultaneously refusing to specify exactly what those requirements were. It was like being asked to solve a mathematical equation where half the variables were classified and the other half changed without notice. Meanwhile, European governments were showing similar interest in Wright aircraft, but with their own unique variations on bureaucratic incompetence. The French wanted exclusive licensing rights for technology they weren't sure they believed existed. The Germans wanted detailed technical specifications for aircraft they intended to copy regardless of patent protections. The British wanted everything the other Europeans were getting, plus a guarantee that no one else would get anything better. Wilbur spent months in Europe, conducting flight demonstrations and negotiating contracts with officials who seemed to view aviation as either a miraculous breakthrough or an elaborate confidence scheme. Depending on their mood and the weather, these demonstrations were spectacles that drew enormous crowds and generated massive publicity, but they also required Wilbur to risk his life repeatedly for the entertainment of people who were primarily interested in whether his aircraft would crash in an amusing manner. The European demonstrations were successful in establishing the Wright brothers' credibility, but they also revealed the challenges of international technology transfer in an era when patent law was more suggestion than requirement. European manufacturers began producing aircraft that incorporated Wright innovations while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of their debt to American inventors. This was legal in some countries, questionable in others, and universally frustrating to the Wright brothers. Back in the United States, Orville was dealing with his own set of challenges. American aviation entrepreneurs had discovered that building aircraft was significantly more difficult than promoting aviation companies to investors. The result was a proliferation of aviation ventures that possessed impressive corporate structures, elaborate marketing materials, and aircraft that couldn't actually fly. The Wright brothers found themselves competing not just with other inventors, but with an entire industry built on speculation, exaggeration, and what would later be recognized as fraud. The patent litigation that followed was epic in scope and Byzantine in complexity. The Wright brothers held fundamental patents on aircraft control systems, but other inventors claimed to have developed independently patented solutions to the same problems. Determining who had invented what, when, and whether their inventions actually worked required legal proceedings that made Jarndyce v. Jarndyce look like a model of judicial efficiency. The patent fights were particularly frustrating because they prevented the Wright brothers from focusing on what they did best, improving aircraft design. While they were spending their time in depositions and courtrooms, other inventors were making incremental improvements to aviation technology. The Wright brothers remained the pioneers of flight, but they were no longer the undisputed leaders in aircraft performance. This situation was complicated by the fact that aviation technology was advancing rapidly. The Wright Flyer of 1903 had been a remarkable achievement, but by 1910 it was clearly obsolete. Other manufacturers were building faster, more reliable, and more capable aircraft using design principles that had been established by the Wright brothers but refined by their competitors. The brothers found themselves in the peculiar position of being simultaneously vindicated and surpassed. The competitive pressure forced them to continue innovating, but their innovations were now being developed under intense public scrutiny. Every new Wright aircraft was analysed by competitors, criticised by journalists, and compared unfavorably to the latest European designs. The brothers, who had once worked in complete privacy, now found their every design decision subject to public debate by people who had never built anything more complex than an opinion. Their training of other pilots also became a significant part of their business. Flying a Wright aircraft required skills that could not be learned from books or lectures. Pilots needed hands-on experience with the unique control systems that made Wright aircraft both capable and challenging to operate. The Wright brothers established flying schools and personally trained many of the early aviation pioneers, who would go on to establish aviation records and found their own aircraft companies. These training programs were both profitable and problematic. Profitable because there was enormous demand for flight training from wealthy enthusiasts who viewed aviation as the ultimate sporting challenge. Problematic because many of these students went on to become competitors, taking their Wright, developed skills, and applying them to aircraft that competed directly with Wright products. The brothers found themselves training their own competition, a situation that was economically necessary but strategically uncomfortable. The exhibition flying that became popular in the early 1910s presented another set of challenges. Air shows drew enormous crowds and generated substantial revenue, but they also required pilots to perform increasingly dangerous maneuvers to satisfy audiences that quickly became blasé about routine flight. What had been miraculous in 1903 was merely interesting by 1910, and merely interesting didn't sell tickets. Wright exhibition pilots found themselves under pressure to perform aerobatic maneuvers that their aircraft had never been designed to handle. The Wright Flyer was a stable, controllable aircraft that excelled at practical transportation, but it was not particularly suited to the loops, rolls, and dives that audiences expected from air shows. Other manufacturers began building aircraft specifically designed for aerobatic performance, capturing market share in what had become an important segment of the aviation industry. The Wright brothers also discovered that success in aviation attracted attention from individuals and organizations whose interests were not aligned with technical progress. Patent speculators bought up dubious aviation patents and used them to harass successful manufacturers. Unscrupulous promoters organized aviation companies, designed primarily to separate investors from their money, rather than to advance the state of flight technology. Sensationalist journalists published articles that prioritized excitement over accuracy, creating public expectations that bore little resemblance to aviation reality. Managing these distractions required skills that had nothing to do with engineering or flying. The Wright brothers needed lawyers to handle patent disputes, accountants to manage their increasingly complex business affairs, and public relations advisors to help them navigate the media attention that accompanied their every move. They were forced to become managers of a growing organization, rather than hands-on inventors, a transition that neither brother found particularly satisfying. The international nature of their business also created challenges that were unprecedented in their experience. Shipping aircraft overseas required dealing with customs regulations, international patent laws, and foreign business practices that varied dramatically from country to country. What worked in the United States might be illegal in France, and what was standard practice in Germany might be incomprehensible in Britain. The Wright brothers found themselves becoming experts in international commerce, a subject that had never appeared in their original career plans. Their manufacturing operations also grew more complex as demand for Wright aircraft increased. What had begun as a custom workshop producing one-off aircraft gradually evolved into something approaching mass production. This transition required new skills, new equipment, and new employees, transforming the intimate partnership that had created the first airplane into a conventional manufacturing company with all the associated administrative overhead. The brothers struggled with this transition. They had succeeded through personal attention to detail and direct involvement in every aspect of aircraft design and construction. As their company grew, they were forced to delegate responsibilities to employees who, however skilled, could not match their personal investment in perfection. Quality control became a constant concern, as did the challenge of maintaining their technical standards while increasing production volume. The financial success that accompanied their technical achievements also created personal challenges. The Wright brothers went from middle-class bicycle mechanics to wealthy businessmen virtually overnight, a transition that required adjustments in their personal lives as well as their professional activities. They moved from modest homes to mansions, from local prominence to international fame, and from financial uncertainty to substantial wealth. These changes brought opportunities but also responsibilities and complications that they had never anticipated. Wilbur, in particular, seemed to struggle with the business aspects of their success. He was more comfortable in the workshop than in the boardroom, more interested in solving technical problems than in managing patent disputes. The stress of running a growing business while defending their intellectual property rights took a toll on his health and his enthusiasm for aviation. He began to talk about retiring from the aircraft business and returning to the simpler life of mechanical experimentation. Orville was more adaptable to their new circumstances, but he also felt the pressure of trying to maintain their technical leadership while managing an increasingly complex organization. He continued to fly and to design new aircraft, but much of his time was consumed by business activities that had little direct connection to aviation technology. The joy of invention was gradually being replaced by the burden of success. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 created new opportunities and new challenges for the Wright brothers and their company. Military demand for aircraft created a massive market for aviation technology, but it also intensified competitive pressures and raised the stakes of technical performance. Aircraft that had been adequate for peacetime exhibitions were suddenly being tested in combat situations where failure meant death rather than embarrassment. Military aviation requirements were also different from civilian needs. The Army wanted aircraft that could carry observers, drop bombs, and engage enemy aircraft in combat. These requirements pushed aircraft design in directions that the Wright brothers had never explored, emphasizing speed, maneuverability, and weapon carrying capacity over the stability and control that had been their primary focus. The European War created a particularly complex situation for American aviation manufacturers. European governments were desperate for aircraft and willing to pay premium prices for immediate delivery, but they were also developing their own aviation industries and learning American manufacturing techniques. The Wright brothers found themselves in the awkward position of profiting from the war while simultaneously training their future competitors. The rapid pace of wartime aviation development also meant that aircraft designs became obsolete much more quickly than they had during peacetime. An aircraft that was state-of-the-art in 1914 might be completely outclassed by 1915 and hopelessly obsolete by 1916. This acceleration of technical progress put enormous pressure on manufacturers to continuously innovate, requiring constant investment in research and development that might be rendered worthless by the next breakthrough. The Wright brothers discovered that military customers had different priorities than civilian buyers. Where civilian customers might tolerate quirky handling characteristics in exchange for reliability, military pilots needed aircraft that could be flown by average pilots under stressful conditions. This requirement pushed aircraft design toward greater inherent stability, exactly the opposite direction from the Wright brothers' original philosophy of controllable instability. The war also highlighted the limitations of the Wright brothers' approach to aircraft design. Their emphasis on careful engineering and methodical testing, while admirable for peacetime development, was too slow for wartime requirements. Military customers needed aircraft delivered in months, not years, and they were willing to accept higher risks in exchange for faster delivery. This environment favored manufacturers who could rapidly iterate designs and quickly scale production, skills that the Wright brothers had never fully developed. By 1915, it was clear that the aviation industry had evolved beyond the Wright brothers' control. They remained respected pioneers and successful businessmen, but they were no longer the dominant force in aircraft design and manufacturing. Younger, more aggressive companies had captured much of the military market, and European manufacturers were rapidly developing their own technical capabilities. Wilbur Wright died in 1912, at the age of 45, officially from typhoid fever, but probably from exhaustion brought on by years of patent litigation and business stress. His death marked the end of the Wright brothers as a partnership and left Orville to manage their business interests alone. Orville continued to innovate and to promote aviation development, but he never again achieved the breakthrough successes that had characterized their early collaboration. The loss of his brother was devastating to Orville, both personally and professionally. They had worked together for so long that their individual contributions to their shared achievements were almost impossible to separate. Wilbur had been the public face of their partnership and the primary strategist in their business dealings. Without him, Orville found himself responsible for aspects of their enterprise that he had never fully mastered and didn't particularly enjoy. Orville eventually sold his interest in the Wright Company and returned to experimental work, but his later innovations never achieved the significance of their early breakthroughs. He lived until 1948, long enough to see aviation evolve from their tentative hops at Kitty Hawk to the jet aircraft and rocket technology that would soon make space flight possible. He witnessed both world wars and the central role that aviation played in their outcomes, validating their early recognition that flight technology would have military as well as civilian applications. The Wright brothers' story illustrates both the possibilities and the limitations of individual innovation in a rapidly evolving technological field. Their breakthrough was genuine and significant, but their ability to maintain technical leadership was limited by the resources and skills required for sustained innovation in a competitive environment. They proved that two determined individuals could solve problems that had challenged humanity for centuries, but they also learned that success in invention does not guarantee success in business. Their legacy is secure not because they dominated the aviation industry they created, but because they established the foundation upon which all subsequent aviation development was built. Every aircraft that has flown since 1903 has incorporated principles that the Wright brothers discovered through their systematic research and methodical experimentation. Their approach to problem solving became the model for modern engineering research, and their insistence on controlling instability rather than avoiding it became a fundamental principle of aircraft design. The Wright brothers succeeded because they combined the right personalities, the right skills, and the right approach to a problem that was ready to be solved. They were methodical enough to conduct systematic research, persistent enough to continue through repeated failures, and intelligent enough to learn from their mistakes. They also had the good fortune to attempt their breakthrough at a time when the necessary supporting technologies existed and the social conditions were favorable to their success. Their achievement reminds us that revolutionary breakthroughs often come from unexpected sources and require combinations of skills that are rarely found in traditional institutions. The Wright brothers succeeded where university researchers and government-funded inventors had failed, not because they were smarter or better funded, but because they approached the problem differently and were willing to invest the time and effort necessary to solve it completely. Perhaps most importantly, the Wright brothers demonstrated that the most significant technical achievements result from sustained effort rather than sudden inspiration. Their first flight was the culmination of years of careful work, not a moment of genius. They succeeded because they were willing to do the tedious, unglamorous work of systematic research, and because they understood that solving difficult problems requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to learn from failure. In the end, the Wright brothers gave humanity the gift of flight, but they also provided a model for how complex technical challenges can be overcome through intelligent effort and systematic research. Their legacy lives on not just in the aircraft that fill our skies, but in the approach to innovation that continues to drive technological progress more than a century after their first tentative hop above the sands of Kitty Hawk.